Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Lauren Ballatin, and I work in NOAA's Climate Program Office. And today's webinar is going to be showcasing projects supported and funded by two teams in our NOAA Climate Program Office, the National Integrated Heat Health Information System and the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. So we have a really good lineup of speakers who are going to be discussing projects related to urban heat research and solutions. And I also want to point out that this webinar is part of a larger webinar series on extreme heat research. So we'll be taking a quick break for June, but we'll be back in July with our next webinar. And if you scan the QR code, that's where we will be posting updates with registration links for future webinars. And on that page, you can also find recordings from the past 3 webinars that we've done for this series. One more thing before we get started, just wanted to let everyone know that we'll have time for questions immediately after each presentation. So feel free to put your questions into the chat and you can submit those anytime. No need to wait until the end of the presentation to do that. So again, thank you all for joining, and I will now turn it over to Jeannie, our moderator, to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Lauren. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jeannie Bay, and I'm a program specialist with the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or RISA, program within NOAA's Climate Program Office. For our first presentation, we are joined by Dev Niogi, who will be presenting on urban climate science for decision-making and evaluation of heat health interventions for Austin, Texas. Dev is the principal investigator of the Extreme Weather and Urban Sustainability, or Texas Lab, and the William Stamps Farish Chair Professor and UNESCO Chair in AI, Water, and Cities at the University of Texas at Austin. He holds a primary appointment in the Jackson School of Geosciences, with joint appointments in civil, architectural, and environmental engineering, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and the Odin Institute for Computational Engineering and Sciences. At UT Austin, he also co-directs the UT City CoLab, a formal partnership between the City of Austin and the University of Texas, focused on advancing urban sustainability and resilience. Prior to joining UT Austin in 2020, Dev served as the Indiana State climatologist for more than 15 years and is professor emeritus at Purdue University. This work that Dev is about to present on is supported by NIHIS. NIHIS is based within the NOAA Climate Program Office, and it is an interagency collaboration between federal departments and agencies working on extreme heat. NIHIS supports comprehensive heat action research and activities, including heat forecasting and risk tracking, collaboration with communities to develop targeted interventions, raising awareness among decision makers and the public, and identifying best practices to advance heat resilience efforts. As Lauren mentioned, at the end of Dev's presentation, we will reserve approximately 3 minutes for audience Q&A, so please feel free to submit any questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function in Vimeo. Dev, I will turn it over to you. Dev, you're muted.
This should take care of it, I hope.
Yep, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Lauren. And I really appreciate the opportunity to not only present the work we could do as part of the NIHS, but also thank NOAA, the CPO, and the NIHS team for being such an incredible stewards of putting together the investigative teams and a collaborative network that has started to work with each other and has really fomented a lot of excitement and research along the work that has been done for heat, not just in Austin, but as I will show, uh, working with partners going across the continental United States and beyond. While I'm presenting this work as a PI for this team, clearly this is a very uh, engaged partnership and project with the city of Austin. And you will see how the results and some of the findings have emerged in terms of where it is being now taken by the city of Austin for a more impactful, enduring outcomes that we can trace back to the NIHIS and CPO efforts on this point. Also, the team members at Texas Lab and Collab, who I will introduce shortly. So the Texas Lab is, as I mentioned, a part of the large research initiative that we have been working on with regards to extreme weather and hurricanes. And one of the embedding elements of this is technology using AI and machine learning, international partnerships, but a fantastic partnerships that we have with the city is where this particular project resides as part of the city research and the collaborative efforts. So the collab, as we call it, is a UT City Climate Collab. It is a collaborative initiative that started about 3 years back between the city of Austin and the University of Texas at Austin, right around the time that this particular project was being initiated. And this focused on addressing the weather and climate issues that the city was facing with regards to extremes in temperature, right from the ice storms to the heat and from drought to floods. And the need for data and solutions became really apparent. So there was a formal framework as we were starting this project to bring researchers, policymakers, community members together, and then the city initiatives sort of working together with us. So the idea has been, which is at the core of this project, that we need local data to complement the lived experiences individuals have, such that when we have data and we have the lived experiences and the story together can provide an information that is required by the policymakers, by the cities to make informed decisions. So a lived experience alone is not powerful enough because it does not have the necessary data to justify the investments. Data by themselves, I mean, there is only so many ways you can make a spreadsheet look so great, but data by itself was useful but not usable in the context of what the city wanted to do, where it should be targeting its investments, where it should be within the range of things that might be available, prioritizing, and as has to be done in optimizing, picking up winners and losers. So, this aspect of data and lived experience leads to informed decision has been the basis of what we have been trying to achieve with regards to this particular project. Now, speaking of data, of course, like many of the heat projects that were supported through NOAA, we started with the mobile mapping, going around the city and getting these maps. And I know a number of cities have been doing that over a period of time. Beyond this, what really started was that we started experimenting what can we do beyond just thermal mapping and doing some uh, active research on the campus. So, using campus as a living environment and a living test bed, we tried to see what is the effect of shade, integrating student engagement, trying to come up with a community that can start seeing solutions at a very campus scale, and then try and take it up to the city level so that we are not just showing one map, but we are actually showing how we are engaging solutions in a very practical way across the campus. And so this became the second part of the thing, that we had a city measurements and a campus based tests of ideas and examples of where and what new data or new methods could be taken in. Third thing that we could use very effectively in terms of mapping heat was utilization of remote sensing data sets. So developing tools and means to make the Earth observation data accessible to the community. Because one of the very interesting feature we found when working with community and looking at remote sense data is that they do not look at satellite products as data. Data to them meant something that is coming out of a sensor that they can see and is giving out numbers. And so an image equals to data was not being resonated in the context of how community could use it in the context of making decision. So images like such, what I'm showing, could be used for making presentations, for making uh, uh, good graphics, but not necessarily equated to data. So this translation that we need to take model information, we need to take satellite information, and we need to take a range of different indices beyond temperature, really started the whole basis of putting a more comprehensive view of looking at temperature across the city. Then the next issue came up was mapping it in terms of the vulnerability, the difference between the surface temperature for the ground, the air temperature that humans can actually feel, and then trying to see the difference that might come with regards to how it maps for the ground versus what it might map with the atmospheric air temperature, and how the two might sometimes match, but that does not mean that what is the ground surface temperature is the air temperature. The next element of all this came up was, this is great. We now have technology, we have data, we have models. But is this what the community feels in terms of the perception of heat as they live in the city? And so we went to the community and asked them by putting up maps, where do you feel the maximum heat hazard when you're traversing the city? So they actually started mapping from their own experiences where they think the heat hotspots are. And what we did with that is then compared with the data that we have to try and see, are there a match? If so, then we know we are using the models and our technology right. And if there's a mismatch, we wanted to try and understand why was that not either being captured by us or not being felt by the community. And so using the human experience as a sensor in terms of mapping Earth observational information really started becoming a very fascinating part of how we could connect with the community in terms of where they feel heat and what that can be done with that regards. And we also requested of them what are the mitigation strategies that they think the city should take up, right from bus shelters to trees to water fountains to gardens to splash pads, and where and what they think this will be a good investment with regards to how the city should start putting this information together. Um, one clear aspect of that was localizing this information. When we start providing climate information or weather information, a lot of that is very useful when we are providing it from the airport or we are using it from some location. uh, but localizing this information at a very neighborhood scale where actual decisions and studies need to be done, this translation of that information into an hyper local environment using some of the tools now that we have with machine learning and other really became a game changer in terms of translating what we wanted the communities to know, what they were saying, and tying up that data together with regards to the whole interface that comes through. And then it was working with models like the WRF model, the weather research forecast models, working with different digital twin environments that we have been creating, and putting this if then strategies that if the city were to implement things like a cool roof, if the city were to implement like a splash pads, what would be the positive impact of that onto the city in terms of so we had to develop some model tools where most models assume a flat roof, and in reality you have a very slanted roof, and what it could be in terms of the area available for green roofing, etc., etc. And so then started looking at the cool roof, green roof, different technology, putting photovoltaics, putting trees, and mapping what could be the net impact that we can start seeing across the city in terms of the value of this mitigation technology, in terms of the on the ground effects that we should realistically expect happening from that. So, this is both from the context of air temperature and in the context of the thermal comfort index, UTCI, which we have started using quite effectively across the city for that matter. Beyond the modeling aspect, then came the part that, okay, if things like reflective payment, which came out as one of the solution, if we were to actually do that, would we start seeing the effects of that? So working with the city and the Department of Public Works, we identified two neighborhoods which looked very similar. And in one neighborhood, we had the entire neighborhood streets put up with a reflective payment, and another one left as is. And you can see the traditional one and the reflective one in the bottom left of the figures. And then you could do thermal mapping to show that there is indeed a very different 30 to 40 degree difference with regards to what it could be from a reflective payment or a shade or others. And we started monitoring this information and found that indeed, as reflective payments are supposed to do, there is a little bit of reduction in temperature during night, uh, during the day, and there could be a difference. So T air slightly rose during the day, and T air slightly cooled at evening. And so this was by the nature of the albedo effects and so forth. So this was an important one that we had to show. Now, we go back to the community and ask them, do you feel this is effective? And roughly about three-fourths of the community felt that there is, the cooling payments and mitigation approaches are actually good and would be helping with the cooling aspect. We conducted some blind tests in which they were made to walk on different streets, record their information, and write this up in terms of the perceptions that they have about the value of this and the cooling associated with the cool pavements and so forth. I'll not go into that looking at a time, but then one of the other aspects that I want to highlight is that while we were doing the study, we are somewhat often fixated when we are trying to say our heat solution that we want to reduce urban heat island. But this urban heat island as a variable itself is extremely complicated. I mean, traditionally, when we had only isolated cities and a very clean non urban area, the difference between urban and rural, which was the definition of urban heat island, made sense. But as we are now becoming into this very connected cities, this concept is becoming difficult to achieve. And so here's an example, for instance, depending on which data set you use, same method, you're going to have a very different indication of what is your urban heat island. And so one of the aspects we have been trying to show is go beyond the context of an urban heat island into something which could be at a very local scale thermal mapping, and then use that hyperlocal information to identify regions which are going to be your priority areas and making the community aware of it and making the city start working in terms of reduction of those spots and so forth. So this urban heat spot mapping rather than urban heat island mapping has become a theme that we are now focusing on with the UHS rather than UHI, and how you do so and etc. will be here. Now, what is the implication of that? So we are trying to put this into different digital twins and trying to visualize this information and make that available, and then engaging back with the community in terms of asking where are the hotspots, where are the framing and so forth. Then going back and grounding this into science, building research publications, developing some dashboards, and making this information available to the city such that they can start mapping which areas have high trees, which areas have low tree cover, where can we start putting more trees into things. And then cities right now consolidating all this information by collaborating with different teams and neighborhoods to see what different efforts are underway. There is a heat resilience playbook, which I'll show in a few seconds. There are just an asset recognition about what are the greening programs being done along the city, and then a development of a heat resilient playbook, which essentially identifies three things: a healthy and prepared Austinites, prioritizing cooling investments, and building our capacity for infrastructure as part of how the city is now taking this information and trying to put this into a much more robust, long living infrastructure outcome that will come. Uh, Going beyond Austin, we have taken this information to create some new health and heat hazard index. This is being looked at across the US, intercontinental US, in terms of the hazard vulnerability, looking at humidity as one of the factor. And indeed, the research was taken and taken to places like in Paris Olympics, where heat was one of the factor. And the same thermal scapes that we developed for Austin, we could develop it for Paris for applications such as for marathon and so forth that could be used for the Paris Olympic information in terms of the impact and so forth. So closing, I'll say there were several lessons that we obtained out of it. First is that we need to localize information. Uh, Hyperlocalization and bringing it to the scale where it is important for the community and decision makers becomes very important. Second, working with and collaborating with the end users and interactively building up the solutions is really the pathway that we have learned in terms of blending technology, models, data, and information. This lived information and data leading to information has become the mantra for what we are trying to do. Scientific grounding, because everything we can come up with is there are a lot of literature out there right now where people can show a pamphlet at a city hall or other things, but unless we have scientifically vetted data for any technology and we can show that independently, we can show this as value, we should be a bit cautious about the claims that come out from some of the mitigation technology. We need to go beyond urban heat island. We need to create this hotspots mapping, create those if-then tools, engage partners, focus on solutions, and ultimately make sure and finding a way that someone at the city, someone with the organization takes this up to not just make a small neighborhood scale, but an infrastructure scale change that can start impacting the city. I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that fantastic and insightful presentation, Dev. We have just about a minute and a half for questions, so perhaps I'll ask just one, but I'll record all of the questions that have been submitted and share them with the speakers afterward. Let's see. So one of the questions reads, how do people in the city find out about this information? Are decision makers communicating about these resources?
We have to have a sustained and continuous engagement process. And this is by engaging different neighborhood groups, by going to the neighborhood events, and going beyond the scientific or academic comfort level and really integrating into many ways that we can engage. We also had a internship program for community partners to come and work with us, give us some ideas, and that has been one way. Now, with regards to the second question about what was the second question?
The second question was around if decision makers are communicating about these resources to the communities.
Yes. In Austin, working with the council, working with the mayor's office, the city manager's office, they have elevated this. There is a during the heat awareness, there is a very large event that takes place, and at a council level, we try to convey this information. And I think there is a very good engagement plan, at least in Austin, that gets communicated. And I know many cities are looking in terms of making heat as an hazard and preparedness akin to what it would be if there was a hurricane coming through.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing your work with us and for joining us today, Dev. We'll transition to our second presentation now. So for our second speaker, we are joined by Ariel Chenard, who will be presenting on co-developing emerging heat management and governance in Southern Nevada. Ariel is the lead for the Nevada Heat Lab and the project coordinator for the California Nevada Applications Program, or CNAP, which is the Western RISA team, which is based at the Desert Research Institute. She leads cross-sector efforts focused on extreme heat resilience and impacts in Nevada. Her work translates research and stakeholder engagement into actionable strategies related to extreme heat, and she specializes in network building for systems-level heat resilience. This work is supported by the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. RISA supports interdisciplinary, place-based partnerships that help communities better understand, plan for, and respond to complex environmental hazards, such as flooding, extreme temperatures, water shortages, wildfires, and severe weather events. RISA teams work across regions of the United States to provide actionable scientific expertise and decision support resources tailored to local needs. Through sustained collaboration with public and private sector partners, including emergency management agencies, utilities, ports, planning departments, businesses, and regional governments, RISA teams help communities reduce risk, strengthen preparedness, and support informed decision-making. As a reminder, the Q&A function will be open during Ariel's presentation. And Ariel, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jeannie. Are you seeing my slides okay?
Yep, they look great and we can hear you clearly.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share how the Heat Lab model is working to establish and expand heat resilience in Nevada, particularly in the Las Vegas metro area. As Jeannie said, the Nevada Heat Lab is part of CNAP, which is the California Nevada Applications Program, which is a NOAA-funded RISA, and is housed at the Desert Research Institute. My team consists of Dr. Tamara Wall, our PI, Dr. Tom Albright, who's up at UNR, Dr. Emma Bloomfield at UNLV, Dr. David Almanza, who's at DRI, Kyan Engel, also at DRI, and myself, I'm the lead for the Nevada Heat Lab at DRI. So the Heat Lab centers the co-production of heat adaptation and resilience strategies with the local stakeholders and communities that are most impacted by heat in our region. And our goal is by centering those frontline practitioners and communities, we can better leverage local knowledge to develop and promote implementable heat adaptation approaches and strategies. Our project fills an existing gap in Southern Nevada. So we provide the collaborating, coordinating, and informing space for all things heat. Just real quick, why heat resilience in Southern Nevada? Yes, it is hot. This is our deadliest natural hazard, as it is in most spaces throughout the United States. Unfortunately, we had 527 deaths in Clark County in 2024 that were caused by heat, 291 in 2025. And by 2055, we're going to be looking at anywhere between 46 to 32 days above 105. And if you look at the right of the slide there, you can see that summer 2024 was truly an exceptionally hot summer and a very good preview of what our summers will be like in the future. So heat here has very disproportionate impacts. We always say that everybody is exposed, but that experience isn't equal. So the experience of extreme heat depends on where you live in town and what your circumstances are. So when we talk about heat impacts in Southern Nevada, we end up talking about everything from drought to access to affordable housing to illegal drug use. And that's what makes heat a systemic issue here. We also have to talk about how heat exacerbates other hazards like poor metro air quality or wildfire smoke. And we do have residents who are heat vulnerable due to age, chronic conditions, or degree of exposure, like in our homeless community. And then there are folks who are heat burdened and living in our UHI neighborhoods that are making very difficult trade-offs in their day-to-day lives when it's hot, like paying the energy bill or affording food, childcare, or medication. Las Vegas has one of the worst UHI effects in the nation. Back in 2022, we worked with NIHIS Kappa Strategies to do the Urban Heat Island Mapping Campaign. Ironically, the mapping campaign actually took place on the third record coldest August day ever. But despite those unusual conditions, the study documented that our hottest neighborhoods are 11 degrees hotter than the coolest. And imagine what that's like when it's 120 degrees here. And that is an exceptional amount of heat for people to live in. The mapping campaign provided kind of a snapshot in time of what UHI looks like here, but it also demonstrated that these communities have been experiencing very extreme heat for a long time. So I want to talk a little bit about the initial conditions that we encountered when our project began in 2023. Work on heat was very deeply siloed. And although it was taking place in very different spaces, and the practitioner connections on heat mitigation and adaptation were extremely fractured. So one of my first tasks was developing a practitioner network called the Heat Working Group. And when I started it in 2023, it had about 8 to 10 people. We did not have much preparation for heat seasons. So there weren't any readiness exercises. It was mostly business as usual until perhaps maybe a heat warning was issued. There was very little resource or information sharing during extreme heat events, a lack of coordinated relationships for heat response. And there were still a lot of misconceptions about heat impacts. And so folks would say things like, well, this really only impacts our homeless community. Like, they're extremely impacted, but this does impact housed folks. This really isn't an emergency, or heat only impacts the poor. So within those deeply kind of siloed and fractured connections, there were also a lot of misperceptions about heat impacts here in Southern Nevada. And there's also skepticism of the value of a collaborating and convening space specific to heat. It was very much, oh, good, another meeting, yay, another working group. So we had a lot of challenges as we first started. And those conditions, like initial conditions, if you think about them in the context of the NOAA-NIHIS heat governance maturity model, Southern Nevada was mostly ones, possibly a few twos, and this was just very, very underdeveloped. And so getting our practitioners used to thinking about heat as a collective problem was some of our initial work. Oh, there we go. The challenge of nobody owns heat was really pushed back at when we started engaging communities. And what we heard from communities is that we all own heat. So there's a big difference between what practitioners were saying at the beginning of our project and what communities were saying. So in an effort to have us all own heat, we created conditions for change and accountability. So we provided a container for that collaborating and convening space, and we showed up for others in their spaces before asking them to show up in ours. The heat working group has now grown to over 100 people, and we provide that information and resource sharing space when there is an extreme heat warning from the National Weather Service. So we hold working group calls to make sure that people are sharing information, thinking about resources they can share. And we often do an after action call that kind of discusses what we can do better or differently next time. And that heat working group has really helped create the conditions for change across the region. We're not afraid to ask hard questions, though we ask them gently. And we're also working on creating the conditions for accountability and letting the work live in other spaces where it best belongs. And to help support that, building capacity in our partners, we are leveraging best practices and knowledge from other places. So how do we connect? We connected initially through community listening sessions, which was very important because previous to these community listening sessions in our urban heat island neighborhoods, the communities most impacted by heat had not been asked about their own needs and priorities and given space to articulate those. We also sit on the Southern Nevada Strong Steering Committee, which is responsible for the 25-year strategic plan. And this is the first time that the strategic plan is going to incorporate heat. There was a Northern Nevada Heat Summit. Reno Sparks is actually the fastest warming city in the United States. And they also did a UHI mapping campaign. We're excited to be working with the Regional Transportation Commission of Southern Nevada on work funded through the Protect Grant, which is going to include a regional heat response plan. We work closely with Clark County Social Services, and I'll be talking about the cooling station usage study in just a second. We've done work around trees and very recently hosted an extreme heat tabletop readiness exercise, the first one since 2022. So cooling stations are the only official response to extreme heat in Southern Nevada, and they are activated by Clark County Social Services in response to a heat warning from the National Weather Service. Dr. David Almanza worked with practitioners in Maricopa County to help understand how to best evaluate the cooling station response, how to do the research, and he conducted this research that provides the first and only evaluation of our only official response. And what we wanted to do was understand how cooling stations are used, who they serve, what is working, and what barriers and challenges people encounter in seeking out cooling resources. So we visited 37 out of the 42 stations, collected 489 surveys, 6 of which were in Spanish. We visited both urban and rural locations. And our cooling stations are libraries, rec centers, shelters, community centers, Salvation Army. One of the challenges, though, is that most of those locations operate on business hours, which means that if your local library closes at 6 p.m., that cooling resource goes away at 6 p.m. I think it was close to 50% of the people we approached with surveys didn't know cooling stations existed and didn't know they were currently in one. And the goal of this is to support data-based decision-making for Clark County Social Services around this research and provide an updated updated picture of how people experience accessing cooling resources in Southern Nevada. Of the respondents that knew they were in a cooling station and were using it for cooling, 68% feel their health is at risk at home. They felt their home was too hot. 32% struggled to pay their bills, and 43% reported unstable housing. So we were able to make some recommendations, including improved signage and messaging, cross-agency communication to help deal with that barrier around awareness of cooling resources, expanded hours. We also learned that people who use cooling stations use them routinely or multiple times during a week, and that this is a resource very worthy of investment and planning. So this work provided baseline data and a capacity building model for further evaluation by Clark County Social Services. And it did lead to extended hours at certain locations during 2025. And we have had cooling stations activate a few times without National Weather Service warnings. And that's important because if you think of how much hotter our hottest neighborhoods are, we have folks experiencing extreme heat throughout the summer, whether or not there's an official warning. Additionally, we've done a lot of work around trees. Kyan Engel joined the Heat Lab in 2025 to help address community and stakeholder needs around shade. Las Vegas has large shade disparities, and Las Vegas is a very hard place to be a tree. Trees tend to kind of dominate the solutions conversation. But there wasn't a good understanding of what trees can and can't do in a very arid and extreme climate. So we worked with 2 DRI scientists to model the impacts of tree canopy, and we used regionally identified tree planting goals, which were 100,000 trees targeted to the most vulnerable neighborhoods. The other scenario was 200,000 trees distributed evenly across the valley, 200,000 trees targeted to hottest neighborhoods, and the max capacity of tree canopy that we have within the metro area, which I believe is about 35%, distributed across the Las Vegas Valley. We started to see a very modest 0.3 degrees Celsius temp reduction at 200,000 trees. But this study supports the idea that targeting how we are exposed can get outcomes much more effectively than trying to, quote, cool a city. So what that means is that trees have the biggest impact on people at like the human scale. After it came out, after the study came out, there was a lot of attention that this research was saying that trees don't cool, which isn't quite accurate, but it did force a discussion around trees tree planting, that trees can be a remedy that is effective, but it's nuanced, and it's something that will require collaborative planning and implementation in communities. And Kyan worked to develop this wonderful infographic that shows that the biggest benefit of trees is not air temperature cooling through transpiration, but the benefit that we get of simply being in the shade. So where are we now? So we are moving towards greater heat governance maturity here in Las Vegas. The Heat Lab has become a trusted collaborator and subject matter expert, and there's increased but still structurally limited ownership of heat by appropriate entities like emergency management or local governments. Our partners recognize that action is needed, but all are constrained by capacity and especially resources. Levers for change have been identified, but the challenge was that those weren't necessarily enacted during what we consider a typical summer like 2025 that wasn't exceptionally hot like 2024. Our efforts around research to operations is very effective in revealing and addressing gaps and in building capacity in partners. And we have pending regional and state level heat response plans. So we're going to continue to provide a collaborating and convening space, provide high quality research and information that addresses stakeholder and community needs. But there are definitely some serious challenges that remain. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Your presentation certainly illustrated how critical this work is in Southern Nevada, so thank you so much for all of your coordinating and convening efforts. Let's see. So we have one question in the chat so far that reads, what does accountability look like, or what could it look like in your framework in Southern Nevada?
That is such a good question, and I need to think through it just a little bit. I think when we talk about accountability, like we are researchers, and we are providing a collaborating and convening space, and we are doing research to provide as high quality of information as we possibly can to help address stakeholder needs. But we are not emergency responders, right? We aren't the people who could necessarily fund the cooling station response. So I think accountability in that sense means having pieces of the work live where they should. And it's been a real challenge for me, activating the heat working group when there's an extreme heat warning, because that's almost a quasi emergency management space. And I'm not an emergency manager. I just play one on Zoom. So there are ways in which we are leveraging that heat working group to ask these questions, but also seeing, like, as a network, that the heat working group also comes together to help support us, which is great. And it means that as we keep engaging with the emergency management community, we're going to be getting some support for that role over the next summers. So it's, accountability is challenging, especially in an environment where people are very under-resourced.
That's a great answer, and I definitely can imagine how that would be difficult to grapple with. But yeah, thank you so much. The Nevada Heat Lab is such a cool model, and I hope that other regions can learn from the work you're all doing. All right. So we now have are out of time for Q&A for Ariel. So we are going to turn to our final presentation. And for this presentation, we are joined by Lad Keith and Sarah Mirau, who will be presenting on integrating 3 plan evaluation approaches for coordinated heat resilience across Arizona. Lad Keith is an associate professor in the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning, director of the Heat Resilience Initiative, associate research professor at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, and distinguished scholar at the University of Arizona. His transdisciplinary research focuses on heat planning, policy, and governance to help increase the heat resilience of communities, regions, and nations around the world. He leads several federally funded research programs and serves on the management committee for the Global Heat Health Information Network, a joint initiative of the World Health Organization and the World Meteorological Organization. Sarah is an associate professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University and will be transitioning in the fall of 2026 to a faculty position at the University of Colorado, Boulder, where she will be affiliated with the Department of Geography, the Institute for Behavioral Science, and the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. She is an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersection of geography and planning to advance urban resilience to hazards. Her recent federally funded research focuses on developing and applying new methodologies to support planning for resilience to extreme heat and other climate-related hazards. And this work is jointly funded through NOAA's RISA and NIHIS program. So, as with previous sessions, the Q&A function will be open, and Lad and Sarah, thank you both for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me get the window open here. Yeah, does everything look good? Great. Yeah, as you mentioned, Sarah and I collaborate quite a lot on different projects. And so what we're going to be presenting today is 3 plan evaluation approaches that we've been kind of collaboratively building with our team over the last 5 or more years, and looking at coordinated heat resilience across Arizona. And again, this work is supported by NOAA through the CLIMAS, Climate Assessment for the Southwest, which covers Arizona and New Mexico. So the CLIMAS RISA program through the Extreme Heat Risk Initiative grant that we received, and then more recently from the Department of Energy's Southwest IFL program. And I will mention, actually, we got good news this morning that the paper that kind of summarizes this work was actually accepted and will be published in Urban Climate. So we just learned about that this morning. So I guess there's some good news to share. So Sarah and I wrote back in 2022 the American Planning Association's first guidebook for planning for urban heat resilience. The QR code is there. It's available for a free download thanks to the NOAA support that we received. And in this guidebook, we looked at different heat resilience strategies, kind of at the top of the sun diagram, looking at those heat mitigation strategies to reduce the urban heat island effect. And then on the bottom of the sun figure, looking at those heat management strategies to help prepare and respond to the heat that we cannot mitigate in the built environment. We also set out 7 principles of urban heat resilience planning. This draws from a paper that Sarah wrote with colleagues, 7 principles of strong climate change planning, and then also adapted for urban heat in the book that was mentioned. And those 7 principles are setting clear urban heat planning goals and associated metrics for success, building a comprehensive fact base of information on heat risks, developing a diverse portfolio of heat mitigation and management strategies, managing climate change uncertainty, coordinating across planning efforts, ensuring inclusive participation in planning processes with the public and community members, and then finally, effective implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So this is the framework that kind of guides the planning process that we set out in the book. What we're going to focus on today, though, is really the coordination of those different plans. And so this idea of plan integration is really important, where we know that from previous research that communities are shaped by their network of plans, which is the collection of community plans that really shape the physical form of the built environment, and therefore shape our exposure and our vulnerability to different hazard risks like flooding, like heat. And we also know from previous research that these plans across the network of plans are rarely coordinated with each other. And so you can kind of see on the diagram just all of the different community plans that could potentially affect the built environment. And just as an example here, you may have a park and recreation plan that call for more urban greening, which can help with things like reducing flooding and reducing the urban heat island effect. But perhaps in your community, you also have a transportation plan that's calling for more roadways or more parking lots. And so that can actually contribute to things like flooding and urban heat island. And when those two things are not coordinated together, communities can unintentionally work against kind of broader goals that they may set. Sarah and I had done a survey of planners back in 2019. And so we found here evidence that 65% of plans and communities of our respondents did say that heat was being addressed in some plan. But as you can see on the chart, there's not a single plan that owns heat. And we've heard about that in the previous presentations, right? And so kind of spread across different plans, and no single plan type is really owning heat, which means that we have to look at all the plans to really understand how communities are shaping the built environment to reduce heat hazards. So that kind of brings us to the 3 ways that we're going to look at the research, and then I'll turn it over to Sarah to talk about the methods a little bit more and then the findings of the project. The first method that we're looking at here is looking at patterns of explicit coordination among the plans, or what we call cross-referencing. And so that's really looking at a single community, all of the network of plans within that community, and how those plans speak to each other, and whether they address each other, whether they reference each other, whether they build on each other, or whether they're kind of isolated. The second is looking at the degree of consistent inclusion of the principles of effective heat planning. And again, those are the 7 principles that we mentioned before on the previous slide. And so kind of going through a content analysis methodology that really helps evaluate whether those 7 principles are being achieved or not. And then finally, looking at the plan integration for resilience scorecard for heat, or PERS for heat, to understand better the policy attention to heat mitigation and spatial patterns in where communities are targeting their heat mitigation priorities. And so this project is located in Arizona. And again, this part of the project was funded by the Department of Energy for the Southwest IFL. So looking at the Arizona urban core, kind of from north to south, including Flagstaff, the Phoenix metropolitan area, Casa Grande, Tucson, down to the border with Nogales. And so kind of a high heat hazard area, but a lot of difference in heat hazards across those communities, and also sizes of the communities as well, which makes it a really interesting case study. And Sarah, I'll turn it over to you there.
Great. So now I'm going to walk through each of these methods and some of our key results. So as Lad introduced, the first approach is really looking at the overall structure of the network of plans. So how well connected are a community's plan network? And so if you go to the next slide, how we do this is we actually map out, look through the plans and look for references to other plans in the community. And then we sort of compile all of those references and then visualize them in a network using social network analysis. And this allows us to actually see which plans are more central versus which plans are more peripheral. And I will say, we've been developing guidebooks for each of these plan evaluation methods. I'll mention that the other two methods, we have existing guidebooks that are on the web, and I'll have links to them. We are in the process right now of developing the guidebook for this approach, but that really walks you step by step in how you can actually apply these methods to your own plans or network of plans. So if you go to the next slide here you can see the results of applying this cross-referencing approach to these 7 diverse communities across Arizona. And you can see first, really it highlights the central importance of general plans, which are required in Arizona, versus we see sort of a lower relative importance or centrality of hazards, climate, and transportation plans. And I think in particular, this highlights what I see as a challenge for heat resilience, which is that hazard mitigation plans, which are typically the main sort of hazard-related plan that communities will have, they tend to be developed by emergency management departments, and they're often not very well connected with other sort of land use and infrastructure planning efforts. And again, this means that some of that information on where your hazard risks are and opportunities for getting funding for mitigation are not being connected to plans to develop new areas or the built environment or to invest in infrastructure, and that's sort of a missed opportunity. So if you go to the next slide, that's a quick highlight of some of the key findings from that first approach. Now we move into the second approach, right, which is our plan quality evaluation for heat resilience. And here we're going to zoom into the actual content of some of the key plans from that plan network, these general plans, climate plans, hazard mitigation plans. And we're looking at to what extent these plans actually address heat and how likely they are to actually be effective in enhancing resilience. And so in order to do that, if you move to the next slide, we read through the whole plan and we look for specific elements that planners and planning scholars widely agree are important for a plan's effectiveness. So our assessment has really 2 components: the quality principles evaluation, where we look at the presence or absence of 56 criteria within those 7 principles of strong heat resilience planning that Lad showed before. So again, goals, fact-based strategies, implementation and monitoring, coordination, public participation, and addressing uncertainty. And then we also look at what type of heat strategies are included in the plan. And here we're looking for 27 specific strategy subcategories across the 4 categories of heat mitigation and heat management from that sun diagram that Lad showed earlier. And so we're trying to see to what extent the city has them. And we're also looking specifically, are they proposing these strategies and are they specifically linking those strategies to heat, or are they proposing them for some other reason? So now jumping into the results here. So here on the left, you can see the overall scores for the 7 principles across all of the plans that we looked at in these different cities. And so you get a sense of how which principles they're doing well on and which ones they could still use some potential improvement. And to the right, you can see that broken down into the specific criteria within those principles. And so there are sort of 4 consistently higher scoring principles across these 7 cities. This is the goals, implementation, coordination, and public participation. And these are important, right? Because these sort of provide important baseline criteria, right? But we also notice that fewer plans have sort of heat specific criteria within these, such as like having a specific heat risk reduction goal or heat specific funding detailed. So if you go to the next slide, in contrast, right? So that's where plans tend to be doing better. Plans tend to be a little bit weaker on the fact base and uncertainty principles. So you can see some of the criteria that plans don't typically meet are having maps of existing heat, future heat projections, or vegetation and urban forestry information. And in general, we see that older plans tend to do a little bit worse than newer plans. So the good news there is we seem like we're doing better in terms of heat planning, but still some room for improvement. And then if you go to the next slide, so again, that was the quality principles. Now we're looking at what kind of heat strategies are included in these plans. And here we see there's really quite a diverse range of strategies that cities are planning across Arizona. But in many cases, we see that actually they're not proposing those and presenting those as heat resilient strategies. They're actually presenting it for something else, and there's not sort of recognizing a potential heat co-benefit. And so that's, potentially a missed opportunity. If you go to the next slide, then moving into this final strategy, so just having to move a little quicker here, the final plan evaluation approach is the Plan Integration for Resilience scorecard. So this is where we dig into the actual actions, the policies that are going to shape the built environment in the plans, and we score them based on whether they would enhance heat resilience or actually reduce it. And we compare, and then we actually map out those strategies across the city. And again, there's a guidebook. This is quite a in-depth process. There's a lot of steps to actually doing this Plan Integration for Resilience scorecard. So if you're interested, I would urge you to download the guidebook on it. But here, just quickly to highlight some of the results, we can see again the different types of policy strategies that cities are using. Particularly, we see a lot of transportation-related ones. We can also see here again mapping out those different heat resilience strategies. We see that they're not necessarily targeting the most heat resilient strategies in the plans to the most vulnerable areas. So there's a potential ability to sort of better target those. And again, so you can see that this provides really more in-depth information, or sort of where are you targeting and what specific strategies are you planning and where, right? And finally, while all of these plan evaluation approaches, can be done looking at existing plans and then providing, I think, can help to improve future plan updates. Something that we've been doing increasingly is actually partnering with communities, with cities, to do these iteratively on-plan drafts so that they can integrate the feedback immediately and help improve planning. So, for example, we've worked with the city of Phoenix and others on this. I wanted to also just flag that these plan evaluation approaches are part of a new framework that was developed by the Center for Heat Resilient Communities. This was the first national center established to address heat at this scale. Lad and I co-led it with Kelly Turner at the UCLA and other 50 other partners from across the country. And this you can download the framework and workbook that sort of walks through a process for developing a heat resilience blueprint as a community. And this includes, again, some of these plan evaluation approaches as part of this process. And so I think I really don't have time here to go into the conclusions, but I would just highlight that these different, plan evaluation approaches, I think, are really complementary, sort of provide different insights and can really help to, again, inform and improve planning for communities. And if you want to know more details, I would definitely urge you to keep an eye out for that future publication. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lad and Sarah. Super interesting work, and congratulations on the great news of having your paper on this work approved to be published this morning. I look forward to reading it when it comes out. So we have time for just one question. I would love to hear a bit more about how local governments with limited capacity can begin applying these frameworks in practice.
Yeah, great. Sarah, I'll take a first stab at this. So kind of one guiding principle that we used in the Center for Heat Resilient Communities was, again, just the idea that different communities have different capacities and are different kind of stages of heat governance. And so in the framework guidebook that Sarah had pointed out that's free to download, there's actually different tiers of activities that you can do. And so again, the plan quality evaluation, which was the second method that we showed, is pretty easy for folks to do. And so I think practitioners can easily pick it up with the guidebook, kind of go through their own plans and score where they're at. So that one is very readily accessible for any planner or any government decision maker to use. Again, the PERS for heat process is a little bit more involved and requires GIS and kind of a little bit more policy expertise. So that one might be better to partner with researchers on. And so the idea with the guidebook, at least, is that we set up different tiers so that kind of no matter where you're at, you can do something constructive to get started.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense. And it's great that you guys had that kind of tiered approach in mind in your analysis. All right. Well, that puts us at time. So thank you again to all of our speakers for today's excellent presentations. These kinds of applied and decision-focused research and collaboration approaches will be essential to shaping effective heat solutions moving forward. I'm going to pass it back to Lauren to wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie. And thanks again to Dev, Ariel, Lad, and Sarah, our speakers today. Just really appreciate you all being here and all of the information that you provided. But just to quickly wrap things up, we will post a recording of this webinar on the NOAA Climate Program Office website within a few days. So if you scan the QR code, you can just bookmark that page and check back for it. And that's also where we will be posting registration for upcoming webinars when those are available. So with that, we will go ahead and conclude, but thanks again to the speakers and thanks to everyone for attending, and see you next time.
Thank you.